on buying goods and services. But that's not what they do at all. That's not how it works. They, before they have any money to spend at all, they have to pay their taxes that are taken off, and their medical care. That's taken off the top of their paycheck, and they're given after-tax income. Milton Friedman developed this anti-labor policy during World War II when he was working for the War Department. But also, before the wage earner can spend the money on goods and services, as the demand says, the wage earner, he or she, has to pay rent for the house. They have to pay medical care. They have to pay the credit card debt. They have to pay the auto loan debt. They have to pay their education debt. So the actual disposable personal income is not simply what they can spend after paying taxes, but what they can spend after paying taxes and rentier services. And that increase in these various forms of economic rent has widened so much that it squeezes what's actually available out of the worker's paycheck to spend on goods and services. And if you don't look at this rentier overhead, then you're not going to understand why finance capitalism today doesn't produce the rosy results that advocates of industrial capitalism talked about. They're 100 years behind the times. They're not looking at the transformation into finance capitalism and how it's transformed the economy.
And this exactly ties back into our inaugural conversation, Michael, because one of the things we emphasized in that conversation is that when neoliberalism was the neoliberal policy paradigm was ushered in as the thing that was going to restore capitalism's mojo, restore its productive dynamism, it did nothing of the sort, for the simple reason that capitalism is no longer competitive. It's monopoly capitalism, and monopoly firms are price makers. They are not price takers. So essentially, they don't have to react to rising prices by supplying more. They can simply react to it by keeping prices high, which is kind of what we are looking at right now. So neoliberalism did not resolve this issue, but on the contrary, it has vastly inflated financialization. So neoliberalism, rather than restoring capitalism's productive dynamism, has actually unleashed the storms of financialization, which bring us regular financial crises, which bring us all these other problems we're talking about, and which have also gone into weakening the productive economy. Michael, I know you want to say something.
Yeah, well, neoliberalism really is financialization. Neoliberalism is financial lobbying for a financier's view of the world. It's the Wall Street's view of the world. That's the central bank's view of the world. It's not the industrialist's view of the world, and it's certainly not the wage earner's view of the world. So the question is, whose perspective are you going to use in looking at how the economy works?
Yeah, so if we may round up this part of the discussion, because we have a couple of really important further questions to discuss, I would say that what's causing the current inflation is a combination of things. Yes, of course, the war, the conflict over Ukraine, which, by the way, the United States is doing nothing to stop, and we will be discussing this at a later date as well. Secondly, yes, monopoly is certainly contributing to it. Financialization is contributing to it. All of these things are contributing to it. But there are two things that are definitely not contributing to it. Number one, the stimulus did not contribute to it because the overwhelming majority of the stimulus never ended up in the pockets of ordinary Americans. And number two, yes, even though there may be a wave of strike activity, which absolutely needs to happen, which workers need in order to catch up with the loss of income, real wages that they've had for a long time. But this is not contributing to inflation. If anything, it is only mildly mitigating the effects of inflation on the lives of workers. So, but ultimately, I would say that the reason why core inflation is high and is likely, in my humble opinion, to remain high, particularly in the very neoliberal financialized capitalisms like the United States and the United Kingdom, is because of the productive debility, the productive problems of the underlying productive problems of the economy. This, I would say, is the main thing that is causing inflation. And as I've argued in my vectors of inflation, unfortunately, because the Federal Reserve, while talking about employment levels and economic activity levels and so on, is actually really concerned about keeping asset inflation going, it is going to fail to deal with it. So that's how I want to sum up this aspect. So we can now shift, perhaps, Michael, to talking about what the Federal Reserve is doing, how are we to understand it, and what's wrong with it.
Well, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 to take monetary policy out of the hands of government. The idea was for actions that the Treasury used to do, managing the economy, would be transferred to Wall Street and to other centers. The Treasury Secretary was not even allowed to be a member of the Federal Reserve Board. J.P. Morgan organized the bankers and said, we're going to take the 12 Treasury districts and we're going to make them into Federal Reserve districts. Basically, we're going to shift economic planning away from Washington and put it in the hands of Wall Street in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and then San Francisco, but we're not going to let the government do the planning. The problem is that people vote for politicians, and you don't vote for who's going to be on the Federal Reserve Board. We've got to take planning away from democracy and put it where it belongs, in the hands of the 1%. The bankers. And that was the purpose of central banks in every country. Central banks were the alternative to socialism. Central banks were to prevent industrial capitalism from developing into socialism, but to develop into a financialized capitalism that, instead of being productive, was predatory. And that explains why, if you look at what Janet Yellen and other anti-labor economists are saying, she'll say, our job is to prevent wages from keeping up with the cost of living. We have to keep wages down to keep our businesses' profits high, because corporations are our customers. Our customers are people, real estate people. Our customers are people buying houses, and if we can raise the debt necessary to buy a house, then we've got an enormous amount of economic rent that's ended up paying interest instead of being used as the tax base, which is what Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and the first line of the Communist Manifesto urged to take land as a public utility.
You know, Michael, all that reminds me of a really interesting strand of the story that you're telling. You know, you rightly reminded us that the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, that J.P. Morgan insisted that even the Treasury Secretary cannot be a member of the Federal Reserve Board, etc. So, you know, particularly in the very era when this financialization really got going, it was accompanied by the rise of a myth, the myth of independent central banks. The idea was that central banks were to be made independent, which means that there should be no political interference in the central banks. And the idea was that this would allow central banks to set monetary policy independently for the good of the economy, to keep employment high and inflation low, etc., etc. In reality, of course, central banks have behaved in ways that have only benefited the financial sector which produces nothing, which makes profit without production. But nevertheless, these are the sectors of the economy whose interests have been minded by the central banks, not the interests of the productive economy. Now, from this point of view, it's really very interesting that it is precisely in the era when labor was very powerful up to the 1970s. It was only in the late 70s that the Federal Reserve was given a new mandate. Up until then, the Federal Reserve's mandate was only to keep inflation low. But with the strength of labor and the Democratic Party being in power under Carter and so on, they passed legislation which added a new mandate for the Federal Reserve, which is that the Federal Reserve should also organize monetary policy in such a way as to keep employment levels up. Of course, no sooner had they passed this legislation than the Federal Reserve acted in precisely the opposite way. Rather than worrying about inflation levels, the Federal Reserve focused only on bringing down inflation. Paul Volcker was made the Federal Reserve chairman because he was known as a sound money man, a man who was willing to restrict money supply to such an extent that and allow inflation interest rates to go as high as they wanted in order to curb inflation and eventually in order to curb inflation eventually, as some of the older ones of you may remember, or some of the rest of you may have read, interest rates went to 18%, double digits, high teens, before they brought inflation down. And they did ultimately. The Federal Reserve didn't bring inflation down. The Federal Reserve simply imposed such a deep recession. Some people will remember the W-shaped recession of the early 1980s, imposed such a deep recession on the American economy and the rest of the world economy as well, as to essentially bring prices down. So in that sense, even though employment was added as a mandate, and today the Federal Reserve chair people, whether it's Janet Yellen, Alan Greenspan, Jerome Powell, Ben Bernanke, they have all continued to use the rhetoric of, oh, we are looking at employment levels, we are going to calibrate our monetary policy to these things. In reality, they have only been concerned about keeping asset inflation going, because as I've said before, and as Michael says, these are the markets on which the assets of the really rich Americans rely for their wealth.
Well, two comments, Radhika. First of all, you said the financial sector is not productive. What does it produce? It produces debt. Debt is what it produces. That's what yields interest. That's its product is debt. Even though it's really an anti-product, that's what it produces. And the debt is a form of overhead. So the financial sector produces overhead, and the effect is to polarize the economy. Secondly, you talk about the shift in the Federal Reserve purpose towards inflation, not towards full employment. It's actually much more subtle than that and much more sinister. You'll listen to Janet Yellen, and she'll say, well, of course the Federal Reserve is trying to increase employment. How do we increase employment? Wages have to fall by 20%. We've got to pay those greedy workers less. And if we can pay them less, then there'll be more employment. So the solution to make more employment is to create unemployment. And if we can create enough unemployment, then workers will become so desperate to eat that they will have to avoid homelessness by actually taking minimum wage jobs, which we are not going to raise in keeping with inflation, because inflation is what's squeezing the budgets basically to this whole economic system designed to transfer wealth from the goods and service producing sector to the rentier debt and monopoly sector. That's the irony. They've twisted all of the meanings into an Orwellian doublethink.
Very interesting. So Michael, what would you say? I mean, what is the Federal Reserve doing, and what is right and wrong with it? Perhaps wrong with it. Right, I think there's very little that's right.
What's wrong with it is that it believes that the way to make an economy grow is to make it poorer. This is a doctrine that the International Monetary Fund tells all of its borrowers, Latin America, Africa, Asia. If you can only prevent labor unionization, if you can only cut social spending, if you can lower wages, you'll be more competitive and you will grow. So yes, we will bail you out of debt so that you can pay the bondholders in the United States and other dollar bondholders and the foreigners who've lent you money, because the World Bank has pushed you into dependency on the creditor nations. If you can pay them by being poor. That's the financial philosophy. The financial philosophy, in a nutshell, is pay labor less, leave the economic surplus for the owners of wealth, the owners of money, and the most of all, the owners of the monopoly of creating credit, creating money. That's what makes Western capitalism different from the Chinese system, where it's the central bank of China that creates the credit, not the commercial banks that end up turning all of this rent into interest and economic overhead that is responsible for most of the cost increases.
No, this is very important. We should probably wrap up our discussion now because we are getting close to an hour. But let me just say a couple of things. So, to add to what you're saying, I will simply say that the Federal Reserve actually, as I said earlier, it has been acting in the interest of the financial sector throughout the neoliberal period. So, and this period I would divide into two quite distinct parts. So, we had the 1980s and 1990s, where, beginning with the Volcker shock, interest rates became very high. And then later on, they did come down a bit, but they remained at historically quite high levels during these decades. So basically, banks were making a lot of money simply by buying bonds and so on, and earning a relatively high interest. Thereafter, particularly after the 2000 bursting of the dot-com bubble, we had the Federal Reserve changing course and adopting a very changing course, by the way, I should add, for a very interesting reason. They realized that the only thing that was keeping the dollar's value up and the economy going even at a weak rate was basically the house price bubble that had been brewing in the US economy since the 1990s. So, in order to keep it going, the Federal Reserve adopted a radically low monetary policy a paradigm which allowed the inflation of those huge asset bubbles that we saw, which ultimately burst in 2008. So, and of course, even after that, the Federal Reserve kept up the easy money policy. So, there are these two distinct periods, but in both cases, they are looking after, in one way or the other, the interests of the financial sector. Now, at the present moment, therefore, when inflation really began to hit, the Federal Reserve basically, first of all, reacted to it. Jerome Powell first reacted to it by saying, oh, we don't have to worry about it. We are going to continue low monetary policy because inflation is going to be transitory. Remember, I'm not endorsing the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. What I'm saying is they did not raise interest rates, which is what they would have willingly done if they thought the threat of inflation was higher, because they first of all dismissed it as transitory, because they couldn't afford to accept that they would need to increase interest rates, because increasing interest rates will prick all these asset bubbles, beginning with the weakest asset bubbles. So first they tried to pretend that they are not going to increase so the inflation is going to be transitory. Then by early 2022, they were forced to admit that inflation was there. It was proving persistent. It was not going to go away easily.